History students, happy Thursday and happy Ice Day. When you open this up, you may or may not have ice outside, and if you do, I hope you can be inside and stay warm. I don't know if this is going to be as much fun to play in as the snow, but you can maybe build an ice sculpture or take some cool pictures of icicles or something like that. Homework, let's start here. All of this is on Facts as well, and you have everything posted on Google Classroom. So starting with the homework this weekend, you're going to have a little bit less homework than normal. Can you find some time to make a family meal into your medieval feast? Make sure you follow the project sheet. And if you can't find yours in your notebook, there is the project sheet also posted on Facts under Resource Documents and posted on Google Classroom. Or if the weather clears up, could you go to the VMFA for the extra credit project? That would be really fun too. Talk to your parents about scheduling a time that you can do these fun projects. Your other homework is to read lesson 59 and to do the note cards about Eleanor of Aquitaine. And there'll be some new things that we'll be talking about with the Crusades. Just as a reminder, this particular map is something that you can continue to review if you go to Google Classroom, and I believe also on Facts under Resources. You can see the link to the game that will help you review. So if you prefer reviewing like that, go ahead and do that. All right, we're going to start today with some knights' prayers. And I'm talking about the Crusader Knights. There were a couple of different orders of knights that came of age in the Crusades, but the one that we're going to be using prayers from are the Knights Templar. The first prayer that they generally prayed was honoring Mary, and that prayer was not listed on the internet that I saw, but it was explained that we praise God in Mary, namely the work that he has done in her, which we turn to her in song. So it must have been a song that they sang. The second prayer that the Knights Templar regularly prayed was in Latin, the Da Pacem Domini. In English, it translates to give peace, O Lord. So let your day start by listening to the words of this prayer. Give peace, O Lord, in our time, because there is no one else who will fight for us if not you, our God. In Latin, it's Da Pacem Domini, and Diebus Nostris, quia non est alius, qui pugnat pro nobis, nisi tu Deus noster. Notice, of course, that they're using Latin because these were Roman Catholic knights. The third prayer that was common to them was a military chant, and listen to what they would chant when they did this. He bore the holy cross, who shattered hell. He was girded with power. He rose on the third day. Alleluia. So a chant like this would be something that would stir them to action, stir them to worship, stir them to want to serve God with their whole hearts as knights. Now, I wanted to tell you a little bit about the knights. There were three main orders of knights in the Crusades: the Teutonic Order, the Hospitallers, and the Knights Templar. The first two of those, Teutonic Order and the Hospitallers, were both started as orders to take care of those who had been hurt or wounded. So they were functionally hospitals that were along the path to the Crusades or in the Holy Land. Both of those, the Teutonics and the Hospitallers, became fighting knights as well, eventually. But they started the other way. Now, the one I wanted to spend a little more time on and tell you a few stories about are the Knights Templar. You may have heard about these particular knights, and if you have, you may have heard of them because they show up in a lot of video games, movies, as kind of an iconic knight, and some of the things that they show up with are not even very true of them. So I wanted to tell you that they're historically true knights, and there's some really interesting things about them. Every time we talk about the Crusades, I'm going to try to convey one overall major point to you. And the picture that I'm trying to paint for you today is a picture of those who did go to the Crusades wholeheartedly wanting to honor and to worship God through their fighting for his kingdom. Now, I promise you, if you're listening very carefully, you'll know this, that there are plenty of people who did not honor God with their behavior in the Crusades. And sometimes these very knights were doing things that were dishonoring to God. But I wanted to start our study of the Crusades by painting a picture for you that there were people, there were knights in particular, that really wanted to lay their lives down for the cause and the sake of Jesus. So I'm going to tell you a few points of them. The Knights Templar they provided a new model for what knights should be. Prior to this, knights were seen as thugs. They were essentially going around the countryside looting for money, just bored or needing money, and they would just go loot and take it. But after the Knights Templar, what happened is that the knights instead were more like monks. They took vows of poverty and chastity, obedience, and vows to fight the infidels, to fight those who were defying the cause of Christ. So this was a new model of what knighthood should be. And I would say it's interesting, that's the one that has stood through the ages. We don't really think of knights as thugs that are looting anymore because of the picture that was painted during these first few Crusades. Second of all, the Knights Templar were very disciplined. These are some really interesting stories. The Knights Templar did not allow themselves to eat meat more than 3 times a week. They said flesh corrupts the body, and so they were mostly vegetarians or bread eaters, I suppose. They didn't believe in wearing any fancy clothes, not fur, not even pointy shoes. And they didn't believe in shoelaces. Shoelaces were too fancy, too extravagant for their taste. They also were disciplined in the sense of chastity or purity. Now, because they took a vow of chastity, they wanted to stay honoring God in this area of their life. They had a rule that said, we cannot kiss any woman, not even our mothers. Isn't that funny? So they were very legalistic about their not kissing a woman when you're not even allowed to kiss your mama. Third point about the Knights Templar is that they never surrendered. They were highly trained, fierce fighters. And in battle, everyone wanted them on their side because they never, ever gave up. Now, this makes sense when you think about the vows that they took, because breaking their vows to them was worse than death. Their vows that they took said, we will never retreat. We will never surrender. We will never even charge into a battle without being ordered. So they were a very disciplined, never surrendering group. Fourth point is that they were unbelievably wealthy. As I told you, they had a vow of poverty, personal poverty, but they had lots of money in their order of knights because lots of people donated land to them, appreciated what they were doing. When people died, they would often leave the Knights Templar their estate or part of their estate. And then the Knights Templar were really savvy businessmen. So they would use this to make more money. They would do investments, they would rent out land, and they even owned, you're not going to believe this because this is on your map right now, the entire island of Cyprus was owned by the Knights Templar. Now, speaking of money, the fifth thing is that they were the first international bankers. This is really interesting. Back in these days, pilgrims would get robbed all the time. It was really dangerous to be a pilgrim and to travel from one place to another. And so the Knights Templar, with all their money and resources, had an idea that today we would call banking. Travelers could deposit money into one of the Knights Templars' facilities in London. Think where that is, in England. And then they would get a letter saying how much money they had put there, and then they could travel all the way to Jerusalem, which was a really long way, take that letter, and then in Jerusalem, they would get back out the money they had put in London. Eventually, there were other spots opened along the path where they could also take out money, and then that was a series of banks that was international and was supported or backed by the knights themselves. The Knights Templar also even loaned to kings. When the kings wanted to do really big projects and they needed money for them, they would borrow from this international banking system. Now, number 6 is that the Knights Templar had a dramatic downfall. Friday, October 13th, 1307, the French government they just say they were irritated, put out with all the Knights Templar. In one morning, they had every single one of the knights arrested out of their family homes, and in a terrible medieval sense that if you've watched The Princess Bride, perhaps you have an idea in your head. They were tortured in that medieval sense. And all the knights were forced to confess things that they hadn't done, which they later recanted, but their recanting wasn't accepted. And then ultimately, the leaders of these knights were burned at the stake, ostensibly because they had confessed these terrible things that they hadn't really done. And then the king disbanded the entire knights and wouldn't allow it to happen anymore just a few years after that. Now, did you notice that said on Friday, October 13th? One of the many things you'll hear in this lesson that kind of sounds like a little bit of the stuff of legends. Friday the 13th was a day when something evil happened. And then finally, number 7, the Knights Templar are still the stuff of legends. They show up in many a legend and much books and men's organizations and all sorts of things, but oftentimes those are not historically accurate at all. The real history of the Knights Templar is very fascinating. All right, I wanted to tell you then, this is, I guess, in a sense, finishing out our prayer, is that the motto of the Knights was Non nobis Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tuo da gloriam. And even if you don't know Latin, you might be able to pick out these words. Non nobis, not to us, Domini, O Lord. Not to us, O Lord, not to us. Sed is but to your name be the glory. Not to us, O Lord, but to your name be the glory. Let's listen to a little bit of this from this choir in Taiwan. Wasn't that beautiful? Not to us, O Lord, not to us, but to thy name be the glory, the motto of the Knights Templar from the first Crusades, first and second Crusades. All right, you should have your note cards out to check, and some of these are quite easy questions. How many Crusades were there? I'm sure you all have the answer, that there were 8 Crusades. And what does Holy Land mean? We still use this term today, but the Holy Land was the term that was used in the medieval times to talk about the land where Jesus lived, Israel. It was not Israel at the time. It was part of the Muslim Empire. Before this, why had pilgrims been going to the Holy Land, and what happened to make it hard for them? Pilgrims had been going to the Holy Land to visit the places where Jesus lived and died and was resurrected, basically for inspiration. Under the Turks, the particular Turks, now for a long time, they had been going and it had only been dangerous because of bandits and robbers. But under the Turks, the pilgrims started being persecuted and they weren't welcomed anymore. This was a turning point, and this helped to stir up the fervor for the Crusades. Right here is a picture of some pilgrims, medieval pilgrims. There were a lot of reasons or kind of things that made up the idea of pilgrimage. It was very expensive. It was really dangerous. Even though if bandits were caught, there were really stiff penalties for stealing. Still, it was very hard to catch them. So there were still a lot of threats of kidnapping and death and losing everything when you were a pilgrim. The roads were bad. There was poor food, or maybe you would go through regions where it was food that you weren't used to. Pilgrims were supposed to be able to stay for free in monasteries, but a lot of times the monasteries didn't have the food to feed them. So the wealthier pilgrims could stay in inns, but let's just say it wasn't like modern day inns. And oftentimes the innkeepers would try to cheat the people out of their money. They might sell them a high price for a nice bed, and then it was flea infested. Or perhaps there was nothing and people just had to put straw on the floor and sleep on that. So this is what life was like in pilgrimage during the medieval times. Now, who asked whom for help in the earliest crusade? It was the Byzantine emperor who asked the Roman Catholic Pope for help. Hold that in your head for just a minute. Why was this surprising after the Great Schism? This is what we just talked about on Tuesday. It was surprising, of course, because of the schism, because of the split between the Eastern and Western Church. You wouldn't have expected that even 100 years later, that the Byzantine emperor would be asking the Roman Catholic Pope for help. And yet he did, because he felt like he needed help. Here's a picture of the medieval world during this time. It's good for you to have this picture in mind, because I'm going to talk later about, we already just talked about how the international banks went from London. You could deposit in London and pull your money out here in Jerusalem. But the pathway, depending on where people were coming from, the pathways to the Crusades would oftentimes go here. Sometimes there would be crusaders who would come on the Mediterranean Sea, on the waters, and even come around Spain to get there. What message did Pope Urban II use to get people to go on the earliest crusade? Okay, so the Pope asked people to fight to reclaim the Holy Land. And he suggested that if they fought, they would be forgiven of their sins and assured eternal reward in heaven. Pope Urban, here in a famous medieval painting, preaching the First Crusade, this is what one of my books says about him. He urged his listeners to rise up, take the cross, and join in a crusade to recover the Holy Land. He told the knights to forget their petty quarrels, to unite in this righteous cause, and win everlasting glory in the kingdom of heaven. God would be the leader of this holy war, and those who joined would be true Christian soldiers. Very familiar language, actually, to many people who grew up in Christian homes and churches and Christian schools, people my age. True Christian soldiers. Now, speaking of Christian soldiers, where does the word crusade come from? It's a soldier kind of word because it comes from this word cross. Crux. Crux is a Latin word for cross. And, of course, this is what the Crusaders would put on their uniforms. People went to the Crusades for many different reasons. And like I said, every time we talk about the Crusades, I'm going to highlight a different aspect of it. Today, we're talking a little bit more about people who are going with devout hearts for God to help Christians in need, wanting to be helpful. There also were people who went as adventure seekers and people who went as an opportunity to make money or gain land, just for their own personal selfish reasons. The earliest crusades, this is even before the first crusade, the earliest crusade that didn't really ever get off the ground was a complete disaster. Because without a plan to feed the people, the Crusaders starved on the long journey. Now, I am going to say that the Byzantine emperor, was really surprised that the Pope stirred up so many people to come and to march on crusade. He thought a few hundred knights might come and help him, and instead it was thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people who didn't have money, didn't have resources, and were starving in through his land. He tried to help feed them, but the Crusaders also plundered innocent villages along the way to get food. And that just, besides doing that, they also often just died of starvation along the way. And this was before they even got closer to the Muslim Turk land and just were decimated by the Turks and their bodies just left along the side of the road. So it was a complete disaster. And like I said, this is even prior to the first crusade. So speaking of the first crusade, you see here that the first crusade went from 1096 to 1099. You can see some of the green dotted lines. You can see the roots of the Crusaders. So you see that they started in France, Germany, those regions, even some started in Rome, Genoa, Venice, and they all headed either by water or land over toward Constantinople first, and then from there down into the Holy Land toward Jerusalem. And that's when they had to, in Turkey, this is the area I was telling you will show up a lot. Modern day Turkey will show up a lot in the Crusaders thing. This is when they were passing through the land of the Turks, and the land of the Turks was under Muslim control at this time. You see here, and you know this from your reading, that the first crusade resulted in actually the Crusaders winning much of what they set out to gain, including winning Jerusalem and winning much of this land that was considered the Holy Land. But remember, it was the Byzantine emperor who asked for the help. The Byzantine emperor, right here in Constantinople, who had asked the Pope, who was in Rome, to help. And the Pope did stir these people up to come. But when they came, they did not give the land back to the Byzantine emperor. They just set up their own kingdoms and started to rule it themselves. They were called Crusader kingdoms or Crusader states. So the Crusaders themselves, who are from Europe, came, won against the Muslim Turks, and then set up their own kingdoms, their own Crusader Crusader states. So this was not at all what the Byzantine emperor had asked for, and caused an even stronger, deeper rift than already existed after the Great Schism of 1054. In what ways was the First Crusade the most successful one? Well, I just mentioned this. They captured lands, they took Jerusalem, which was the ultimate prize, the place of so much of the Bible history. They split it into 4 regions and ruled it for quite a long time, actually, 100 years. It's not a small amount. So this right here, Pope Eugene III, he was a later pope because, like I said, it was 100 years that passed before the Second Crusade. And at this point, right here, back here, you see 1099 was the time of the First Crusade. So when the First Crusade ended, the next year is 1100. And you guys remember that means it's the beginning of what century? Not the 11th. It's the end of the 11th century. It's the beginning of the 12th century. So here at the dawn of the 12th century, the Pope and the Church were more powerful than ever before. Ever since Charlemagne's day, kings and emperors had assumed the right to defend Christendom, that's the Christian land, and to fight the pagans and infidels. That would be the language they would use. But when Pope Urban had preached and organized the First Crusade, no one questioned his right to do so. In fact, like I told you, the Byzantine emperor asked for his help. Now people look to the Pope rather than to the Holy Roman Emperor for leadership. The Pope's power grew. The Holy Roman Emperor's power got smaller and smaller and smaller. The Holy Roman Empire was now only a collection of German states and then northern Italy. It had lost all its influence on peoples west of the Rhine River. That's from the book I've been reading, The World of Walls. This is a picture of Pope Eugene III, who proclaimed the Second Crusade. 100 years later, who inspired the King of France and the Holy Roman Emperor to go on the Second Crusade? Well, in addition to the Pope Eugene who proclaimed it, it was really the monk named Bernard of Clairvaux who inspired it through his inspirational preaching. Now, he was good at preaching, and in these times, if you were a monk and you were good at preaching, they assumed you could fight too. He was not a good military strategist, and the Crusaders were stopped by the Turks. Many of them died. It was not successful for the Crusaders. We're closing out the lesson, but don't sign off because you're going to want to stay to the very end here. First, here's a picture of Bernard of Clairvaux. I'm going to tell you that he has a number of famous quotes that you may have heard of before. I'm going to read you a few. Starting over here on the left. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. You ever mean to do the right thing, but you don't do it? Somebody might say that to you. Look over here on the right. What we love, we shall grow to resemble. Ooh, this makes us think we need to love things that are good and beautiful and true, so we can grow to resemble what is good and beautiful and true. Look over here. You may have heard something like this before on the left. What I know of the divine science and holy scripture, I learned in the woods and fields. He loved to go wander outside, and he felt like God taught him when he was in nature. Look over to the right. There is no greater misery than false joy. Whew! That's when defeat is snatched from the jaws of victory, isn't it? Okay, back over to the left. This one is a good quote for students. If you concentrate hard on the state you are in, It would be surprising if you have time for anything else. Focus a little harder on your studies, perhaps, and you might not have as much distraction time. Anyway, Bernard of Clairvaux, that wasn't my words. Let's have a few that are actually about Jesus since he was a monk. Here's one. Rest is in him alone. Man knows no peace in the world, but he has no disturbance when he is with God. Over to the left, second to last. Jesus, the very thought of thee with sweetness fills my breast, but sweeter far thy face to see, and in thy presence rest. And finally, in Latin, qui me amat, emet et canem meum. Who loves me will love my dog also. Does anybody else feel like that? I have a very cute dog named Clifford, and I think that you would love Clifford without needing to love me. But whoever loves me must love my dog, said Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, speaking of Bernard, Bernard was honored by the Catholic Church. So he is forever remembered, and perhaps some of you recognize his name. Saint Bernard. That's it, guys. Have a wonderful ice day, and I will see you on Tuesday.